and welcome back to another episode of Growing Pains. In today's episode, I'm going to be joined by Tim Sugaipov. He's a close friend of mine from university, and he was actually an analytics engineer at a mobile studio called Trailmix Games over in the UK. Trailmix Games is currently going into kind of their scale-up phase. They're most well known for their game Love and Pies, in case anyone's played it. But yeah, this discussion, we really just dive deeply into data and the use cases of data in the creative industry. Tim's had a mixed background working in data and tech and then transitioning to the games industries, and so seeing the challenges associated both with the tech world and then also how that kind of faces it into the game side. So it was a very interesting conversation to hear about sort of the different roles of data and the functions of data in games specifically, and how teams can use that to make better informed decision making, and specifically with that relation to the creative industry and how you use data in a way to, I guess, promote and expedite what you're building rather than limit it. So using data correctly for, I guess, the creative elements. So yeah, it was a really interesting conversation, and I hope there's a lot that everyone can learn. And I know data as a function is one that's a little bit more iffy when it comes to a lot of game studios and people. But I think Tim really frames the conversation in a really good way to understand how you can use data without it kind of taking over everything as it seems to be doing a lot of times. So I think it's a good balance and good for understanding just how the function works. I hope you enjoy, and I will catch you on the next one. Hi, Tim. Thanks for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about like everything on data. So just to start, could you give me a quick sort of background on yourself, your journey so far from university to like getting into data and the game side as well?
Yeah, sure. So been in data for about 5+ years now. Did a bit, I think, like for my transition into data, I did a bit of work in like admin initially for a year. And then I guess from that, COVID happened. No more admin jobs really around. So started looking around for things. Found like a nice little data consultancy started up by some former Bumble data leads. Was first hired there. Had a really fun little journey over 3 years of just working with a variety of businesses, mostly in tech, uh, just different things happening here and there. And then I transitioned to gaming after that. Like joined Trailmix Games, which was a mobile games developer,
Yep, yep.
founded by ex King, leads, I guess, and then owned by Supercell. So I did that for about a year and a bit, and now I'm kind of back into tech with just Free Now, which is a mobility app.
Nice. So ditching the games industry behind, going back to the real stuff, or the stuff that makes money, I guess.
Not in that way specifically, right? To be fair, apps and games, like mobile games specifically, are very similar when you kind of just
Yeah.
look at them.
I
It's
mean,
like this the kind of infrastructure you need is the same. Just I guess there's probably actually less going on in a app than there is in a game, which we can go into.
oh yeah,
You
I've
know,
said that a lot of times. I mean, a mobile game is essentially a SaaS product, right? At the end of the day, that is kind of what it is. It's a very heavy duty optimized SaaS product that breaks with a billion different interactions added on top.
yeah, it's a wild experience. I'll tell you that. Just especially going from like tech and even having some relatively complicated apps. Like if you go from like dating apps which have like user on user interaction, right? You'd
Hmm.
assume, oh, that's going to be complicated, or maybe you have some sort of B2B and B2C platform, right? And that's also relatively complicated from a data perspective, right? And then you go to gaming, it's like, okay, how about we throw all of those things together and just, you know, try other random things in the middle as well, just, that just happen.
Yeah.
So, and it's all kind of a one product that just behaves and it like evolves very quickly, right? So it's
Hmm.
not it's like today we're doing this thing and now today we're like next month we release a couple more features and suddenly it breaks everything completely, so you have to redo everything. Yeah, it's definitely like a fast-paced environment. Let's go with that one.
Oh yeah, you're telling me. But yeah, so I guess to just reframe this conversation in terms of the data side, I think data is still, well, it's not exactly new to games anymore exactly because, mobile is the biggest sort of proponent when it comes to revenues. And even bigger like PC console titles, you're looking at the biggest games out there, like your Fortnite, Roblox, all these, a lot of them have that freemium free to play. model which uses a lot of data, obviously. So I think the conversation of why do we use data in games is a little bit outdated, even though on the indie side, I think it's not really as prevalent as what you're seeing in the rest of the industry in a lot of ways. But I think there's obviously a lot you can take away from it. I think one thing, because this is, even when we were discussing things earlier, it's like a conversation that always comes up in terms of just what exactly is the purview of data, right? Like there's so many different roles now. There's the data scientist, the data engineer, the data analyst. Like we discussed this as well in terms of like, what is your role specifically? And like even in traditional tech companies, but this is even more so in games where the field of data isn't necessarily as understood because it is almost this outside thing. What is data exactly when it comes to as a career function when you're looking at breaking it down between all those terms? Like what is the separation and what does it mean to work as a data engineer versus a data analyst versus, a data scientist? And where does each of those sort of fit in a product life cycle when you're looking at the back end?
Yeah, I think that's like a very large question. So I think we could kind of break it down first of kind of what we would expect the data team to be in an organization. And I say this more in not on the way it actually happens, but what we would
Yeah, the
realistically
ideal
want
versus
it
the
to be.
real. Yeah.
Yeah, so we got, for example, like the ideal scenario is your data team's kind of doing two functions, right? They are one, the strategy side. So they essentially tell you the best ways to run the business, more optimized ways of doing things, right? And really a better way of understanding your data, right? They're essentially your guide, so you don't make the wrong decisions, or at least you feel comfortable in decisions you're making. And that can be done for a variety of ways, right? That could just be through just supporting via just regular monitoring, so just regular daily dashboards and just showing the business health. And then on top of that, you could also be doing predictive modeling, just like lifetime value of the player specifically would be something you do. You could do like player
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
segmentation,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
just to just kind of target different cohorts in different ways. So that would be kind of the strategy side, right? And then I think you also have the R&D, which is more stuff like where the more complex machine learning gets involved, right? So maybe you're doing some development on it really depends on what it is, but like more heavy duty, like convolutional neural networks, right? Generative AI, if you're trying to implement that somehow, right? So if you're trying to, let's say, like we want to like inject the chatbot into something, that would probably be something that would be developed by the data team. Ideally, sometimes it's outsourced because maybe you don't have the know-how internally, so you would bring
Yeah.
somebody else in for that. But that's kind of the general gist of like this positioning you would
Yeah.
have. Um, the way I guess like you would have like the team split really in terms of
Mm-hmm.
roles is again, this is not really the way that this goes in like in the real world, but generally what you would have is you'd have the data engineer who would be essentially in charge of the whole like data pipeline. And when we talk about data pipeline, it's literally just taking data and then just surfacing it somewhere, right, wherever it's needed.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be used by for analysis by just other parts of the data team like the data scientists or the data analysts, or it's used by the actual stakeholders like product or marketing to make decisions.
Okay, so that's
So that's
essentially like the transformative layer where they're getting the raw data and like funneling it to the right place essentially for the analysis or the rest of the things to be built out.
So, so yeah, there's a couple of things to it, right? So the transformative layer is more, I guess, done by the analytics engineering part, which there's a kind of a distinction here, but that's why I kind of wanted to keep it more just down to data engineering specifically,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a bit easier to understand. But what you would do initially is you would try to get the data out somehow, right? That requires process building, right? So
Yeah.
you'd have some sort of scripts. You might have some sort of data vendor that you're working with that gets the data to you, and then you can just perform transformations, which is easier, but that's costly, right? So it really depends on the setup, but generally, first you get the data out somehow, then you clean it, then you transform it in some ways, into something that the business can actually consume, and then first usually,
Okay, wait,
maybe in
Tim.
like a B or somewhere else.
We just lost you for like 5 seconds there.
Did you lose me on that?
Yeah.
Which one? Okay, cool.
No, I mean it just paused. The screen paused. So just go over that last part of from the point of when you were talking about the transform part. From then on, I think the transform part was right, and then after that it cut.
Yeah, yeah. So after you transform the data essentially into something the business can consume, you would surface it, right? And that would be in the BI tool, or that might just be specifically for the data scientists to use in their models, right?
Yeah. Okay, and
Yeah.
then then tell me like the data scientist and analytics layer or data analyst layer. That's just where they then have that data in, I guess, your basic BI tools like Tableau, Looker, and that's where you build sort of the dashboards and sort of the story around the data, and that's where it actually gets used for business decision making, right?
Yeah, so I think there's like a distinction needs to be made between a scientist and an analyst. Specifically, in my mind, I would imagine a scientist more as a, I guess, I'm like a statistician almost,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then sometimes with more programming ability, that would be actually something we would call a machine learning engineer, where they would just basically, help optimize and build like these machine learning models that are used by the business. But generally, that's the person that goes into the data, right, and really performs really complicated analysis on it, right, and make sure there's no biases and the general just a flow of what you would do when you're doing a statistical analysis, right? And the analyst is more somebody, I guess, that's more, I guess, front end, somebody that actually like speaks to the stakeholders on a regular basis, right? Just tries to understand what the problems are and just kind of mostly does the analysis specifically
Mm-hmm.
from the BI tool layer. So they'd probably make presentations. They might just, they might be making dashboards. That's usually something that's asked of a data analyst, but not always specifically in the spec. And they are probably also messing around with some Jupyter notebooks and just building reports just to say, hey, this is what we see in the business. This is the way we see going forward, essentially.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good just kind of description. So you mentioned that's basically the ideal, right? That's like what we want. But because there's a lot of, I guess, misinformation in how data works in a lot of these places, that's not how it works. So I guess walk me through specifically at Trailmix, which is, I guess the most mobile-centric game company. What was the data layer like there? Like how were you positioned? How was it? How was that pipeline run essentially between the different options?
So I think when you're working for a smaller company, right, you just end up picking up more roles anyway as you go. So in this specific case, right, I was an analytics engineer, so I was more focused on, I guess, the transformative layer, right? So and then just working more directly with, I guess, the data scientists and the analysts to get them what they need, right? But then also I was taking on a lot of the report building specifically, especially since we were migrating from one of our BI platforms to another. So it's a little bit kind of you pick things up as you go. Really, it's not something that's really predefined. We do also have a data engineer essentially who was more in charge of, I guess, the extracting layer, right? Which is complicated in its own right because there's a lot of things going on. Like you have, both your marketing and the actual in-game data coming in, and they come in different streams. So you would have to, if you're doing like live monitoring of a game, which you should be doing, right? That's stream data, right? That's a separate pipeline. And then after that, you also have, the actual data that's going to get ingested by the modeling layer and get consumed by everybody in the business. But that's usually delayed by like a day because the data itself is not very stable within the day because of bugs and maybe some releases that are going live. So you don't really want to be basing your decisions on something that's come out just right now. Just
Yeah.
only unless something looks really wrong. Um, so that would be like where the I guess I was sitting specifically. We also had, from what I recall at the time, we had a data analyst and a data scientist. The data scientist specifically was more focused on the A/B testing side. So
Hmm.
once you just testing features in the game, balancing changes, just seeing how that affects the cohorts. Also, just usually before a feature is released, it would be A/B tested. So you'd be like, okay, we have a big release coming
Yeah.
up, like roll it out bit by bit, just make sure nothing's broken, everything's working correctly, right? And just get like a general sense of the health of the feature before it goes live to the masses. So that would be more the responsibility of the scientist. And then the analyst specifically would be the one building the reports and also just working with the stakeholders and trying to just explain what's going on in the data that they might not necessarily understand.
Cool. And then I guess in sort of the broader scope there, because you mentioned a few different things. Obviously, you have like the A/B testing with the data scientist, you're transforming it. The analyst is building the models almost for front end for people to use. How does the data function sort of sit within the wider teams in a games company like that? when who you're speaking to, when it's product marketing, like how do you engage with different teams and how's that data then used, or how those functions used to implement on the data strategy itself in terms of what you're gathering and how that's sort of developing the product itself.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, like if we were talking about it specifically Trailmix, it's more you just kind of interact with all the stakeholders at the same time, right? I think eventually we got a distinction between when we hired a marketing data scientist. So we essentially said, okay, this is a product data scientist, this is the marketing data scientist. So they interact with the separate divisions, right? But like as an analytics engineer, I'm essentially interacting with all the pipelines.
Hmm.
In a perfect world, you would have two people, one that's dealing with the product side and one's dealing with the marketing side, just because they are very different streams, right? And you kind of, you don't really want to be splitting the focus between both because they have different issues. So, but generally, that's the way that the data was consumed in the company. Is you'd actually, our product team was actually very data savvy, right? So they could write their own SQL. They could actually go into the data. So actually, they demanded more from the models. They wanted a lot more self-serve, right? While if the marketing team just kind of wanted, okay, I just want to get a report, I just want a table specifically, and I just want to see the things I've been seeing, right? And so you have different requirements from different groups here. Usually, you wouldn't have this kind of divide. I think usually you would expect I guess that your stakeholders to just be consuming the reports rather than
Hmm.
diving into data themselves. So this is more of like, I guess, like you could say the product team was also more just like a mini analyst team in a way,
Yeah,
right? Which I guess is a plus side when you got a small company, right? Because at least you can cover more ground, and they have a
yeah.
better understanding of the domain anyway, so they can help just the data team understand exactly what's going on.
Yeah, so I
Which
mean, they were essentially technical product managers, right? Like I think as a PM myself, it is always better when you're working in a tech-enabled product to understand what's happening. Because I mean, a lot of the product side is about building that product, having that long-term vision and strategy, and so like you need to know what the data is saying and know what you need to get out of the data. So it definitely helps, I think, if you can do some of the coding, if you can optimize those models for yourself to get out the results that you want, right?
Yeah, I think that is true. It does depend, I guess, on the tool you're using. Oh, sorry, because for example, like we were using a lot of BigQuery, right? And actually, it can be very costly if you're writing the incorrect SQL because what the way BigQuery bills you is based on data processed. So if you write a really bad query, right, when you have like a really large table, it will just be extremely costly. Also, it's probably going to take a while to load, right? So this is kind of why it's generally good to just have like collaboration between the teams, right? So it's not like, oh, the PM just kind of dive in and go into this, but that's generally a consideration you should have when building these models, right? Because before I think I joined, we didn't actually have any models that could
Yeah.
be used for self-service. So it was just kind of the wild west of just custom SQL going everywhere and then dashboards not loading and people just being really confused on what's going on. And then you're like, okay, no, we need to just build out the pipeline correctly. And if you build up the pipeline correctly, then it's good for the consumption and everybody gets what they want. Because also the last thing you want is everybody has their own way of defining business logic, right? And imagine, we have a metric, right? We think, oh, I think, I will calculate this one way, and you decide it a different way, right? And then we come back and we get different results, right? So then we start arguing about like something that we really shouldn't be arguing about because, well, one of us is maybe wrong, maybe both of us are wrong, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the reason like we would have the whole modeling layer, right? It is for that
Hmm.
consumption. You don't realistically want your PMs to spend most of their time writing SQL and trying to get the data that they need. You want them to essentially just be able to do what they do best, right? And that's just help the product grow.
Exactly. Oh, nice. And then I guess so taking it back, one of the things that I find really interesting about your background when it comes to looking at the games lens as well is that, like you mentioned, you've been on kind of this agency side where you worked in a lot of different tech products. So how did the games setup compare, right? How did the operations of data in terms of how it was implemented? Because I think you mentioned it here as well a little bit where the way it's implemented, there was a lot of sort of messiness to it, and you need something that functions. And I think that's something, when people are first starting out, whether it's mobile, even if it's like a free to play or premium PC game, for instance, they don't always think about data and how it should be set up from the start. And that obviously leads to a lot of tech debt that then in the future sort of limits what you can do in a lot of ways. So what was the biggest shifts that you saw between, I guess, the other technology companies or other app companies that you worked with versus what you saw in the game side? And how should people on the game side be thinking about it when they're first looking to set up their data pipeline?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, right? Because you're going to have tech debt with any product you do, right? Especially if you have any sort of level of maturity of it, it's just going to be the nature of, you iterated, you made some decisions to survive, and then that just kind of persists until somebody goes in and fixes it. The problem with games is, well, unlike tech, an app can only change so much. A game product can change drastically, right? Your whole economy can change, the way you earn currency, just the way the game even functions, right? So I think like the story on the way I think Love and Pies, which is the Trailmix's main game, was built. Initially, it was supposed to be a merge free, and then it became a merge two, which you could
Yeah.
imagine changes things quite a bit, and just the way that whole metadata works. So, and you have fragments from that, right? Just still like back just in the game, and you just
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
kind of account for that as you go through it, right? And you also can't compare it in the same ways because essentially you've got two different products. But I think the thing that you see a lot in just tech in general is I think the actual app itself would usually be simpler, right? Unless you're like looking like a bigger, more established app, right? Then it's like, okay, maybe it has like additional features, and then it gets a bit closer to what a
Yeah.
game would do. But usually those don't interact with each other, right? But the
Definitely not.
game, yeah, but the game does. So it's like, imagine like you have like for example the mobility app, right? You have the B2C, which is ride hailings, for example, like you just get rides, right? But then you also have a B2B element, which is okay, now a business can hire a fleet of cars to transport people, right? But you would not get one to interact with the other. Essentially, it's two different functions, right? But with a game, right, let's say I'm releasing a new feature, right, that has some sort of element. It has like a new, I think like we did like card packs, for example, right? And this had its whole economy, had its own currency, right? It had its own way of earning things, but you could somehow get bits out of this loop that feed back into the main game progression, right? So you don't get this kind of, I guess, interconnectedness between features in tech.
Yeah.
At least
No,
not, at
absolutely.
least not to my experience.
No, same here. I mean, I think that's why I always kind of shout about it to outside the industry where I'm like, oh, games are, especially like if you're building SaaS versus like a mobile or free to play game, like games are just by and far just so much more complicated products just all around. It's a miracle that any game's ever actually made. And especially like what you mentioned when you're building from the pivots becoming merge twos, merge three, that kind of thing. I mean, I think every game from conception to the point of release goes through so many pivots, like every product does. But in a game, it's even worse because you have to then essentially reorientate your entire strategy for how you're building this product like every couple of months. If you're changing genres, if you're changing the actual mechanics, you're like essentially redesigning almost the entire core functionality of it, which even in an MVP you don't exactly do with a lot of bigger tech products. It usually starts with we have the minimum viable thing, and then you sort of build sticks and stones on that. And I think that's just a lot harder to do in games. Like early access and things have enabled it a little bit, but players being who they are, they just expect a certain level of quality with the content they consume. So it's almost kind of a limitation where you can't, even with early access games or with early release games, like it is an MVP, but it also can't be exactly an MVP because people expect to be just fed constant content throughout, and that sort of pipeline needs to be existing and needs to make sense very early on for you to retain and grow an audience. So it is a very just complex thing to balance that I think right now is becoming even harder just with how tech is changing, with how the scope for games is changing, especially kind of in the more international market that we're kind of dealing with. But I mean, bringing it to the other side then. So we've got this thing of data very important in terms of understanding over time, especially free to play, premium game, well not premium but more free to play or mobile game. In terms of growing that game, growing its strategy, getting customer bases, retaining it. This is really going more into like the uses of data. What was the most common sort of use cases that you saw, and where is data kind of needed, and where is it too much? A lot of people have this pushback that games is a creative art, right? So does using data limit you in terms of what you can build? Does it limit the art of a game and the way that people can interact with it because you are making database decisions when you're looking at what to build? So what is sort of the boundary between how you use this data to inform the actual creative and design process for building the game?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because I'm also in the belief that, data can, be very powerful when used correctly, but it can also be very misleading, right? I think there's a famous quote from a statistician, right? It's like, if you torture the data enough, it will speak, right?
Yeah.
But the question is it going to speak the truth or is it going to just lead you astray? So, and I think that's kind of where the balance really should be, right? Is you kind of need to take a step back and say, what am I realistically looking for? What's, the most important thing for me right now, right? And not really kind of trying to dig into the weeds a bit too much, right? I think that's kind of the issue that I saw a lot of Trailmix. Just keep digging, keep looking for something, right? But like sometimes, you need to like kind of say there needs to be some sort of innovation, right? We can't just make the same thing that worked before. You need to take a risk somewhere, and you can't. Data is not going to tell you that. Data tells you what happened before and what is happening now, but it's not telling you what's going to happen in the future. You can get that through predictive modeling, but again, that's based on what already happened. You cannot predict like events that haven't happened before,
Yeah.
essentially. So it's that's the thing to keep in mind, right? It's like saying, oh well, today we have this much runway because funding is good and the economy is doing great, and then tomorrow we don't have any funding at all, right? So like you can't put that in the predictive model, right? Just
Yeah.
that's it's
Yeah, I
just
mean, I
it,
think we also live in a time where we've just experienced so many black swan events, and with the way technology's changed, I mean, mobile didn't even exist as a platform, 10, 15 years ago, really. So and games itself is also a fairly young industry. So when you're looking at it from a broad scope in terms of how far we've just come and how technology's changed, and then things how COVID changed lives and how that led to sort of the investing fuel and the economy downturn now. So there's so many considerations, and this obviously impacts the people, right? This impacts your players. I think I did another podcast with another person where we went into the research of knowing who your customer base is. And like you said, I don't think you can necessarily have a predictive model to say, oh yeah, tell me how the world economy is going to shift in 3 years' time and who's going to be my player then, how my whale's going to change, how's all the privacy policy going to change in terms of the data that I can accrue. None of that is something that you can sort of future proof. You can't necessarily future proof for trends. You can just try to innovate and I guess follow some of that creative process of like, what do I like? Why am I building it? And I think this goes for any product really, like where you should always build something that you want out there first and foremost. Because if you don't like it, if you don't like what you're building, if you don't want to play the game that you're building, why the hell are you building it? If it's just to follow a trend or something, I just don't see that being a successful thing in the end because players are very discerning, and especially if you're kind of indie or smaller, such a saturated market. If you're not building something for yourself first in terms of this is a game I would love to play and this is something that I find engaging, even if it does have shitty monetary mechanics or whatever else, maybe you're somebody who really loves gacha, who knows, um, then there's just no point building a game at that point for me if you just don't have love for the thing that you're trying to achieve with it. And that's beyond games as well. That's just any product in a way.
yeah, I mean that's exactly right. Like I feel there's a I think games is a little bit like a bit more, how should I put it? It behaves a little bit more differently than like let's say normal tech product, right? But even like so you go for like like maybe focus group testing, and you say, oh, okay, people like this, people want this, right? So we'll make that, right? And I think with like a basic tech product, I mean, I think it feels a little bit easier because generally tech tends to solve a problem. It doesn't form some sort of emotional connection,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
But when you're looking at kind of trying to say, oh, people like this kind of game and they like this kind of theme, right? And then you just try to essentially just condense it to all of this and you kind of remove the creative process of it. I think what you're going to get is just a very sterile product, right? And I think that's fine if it's a tech product, right? Because it's just there to solve a problem, right? Somebody just wants the problem, the pain point that they have to go away. And that's completely fine. But I think with a game, which is, this is, entertainment, this is something that you do to kind of go away, maybe from the real world sometimes, right? Some sort of escapism is there, right? You don't realistically want more of the same. You want
Mm-hmm.
something interesting, something you haven't seen before, right? Or
Yeah.
it's just you need a hook, right? I feel
Yeah.
that's the main thing.
No, I mean games are an experience, right? That's the whole point of it. Like you said, I think what I like what you said specifically there was that like it's an emotional connection. It's a product with emotion behind it. Like you're trying to incite that within your player, right? Whether you're doing it to monetize them or whether you're just doing it to sell a good story, that's a slightly a different story. But at the end of the day, it is about having that emotional resonance to a degree with the person that they are enjoying this as an experience that is adding to their livelihoods, but not necessarily just solving a pain point from a tech perspective or that kind of thing. So no, I really like that, and I think knowing that you're trying to build a product that relates to emotion, and almost data is this way of trying to quantify that emotion, right? You're trying to quantify how people are going to perceive it. Like, how do you perceive that element? Like, how do you quantify the emotion part? Like, what's the separation?
Yeah, I think there's like a lot of different ways you could go about this, right? There's like a lot of like you could do, for example, on the basic side, just sentiment analysis on, maybe just player surveys and other things. But there could be other things like you could just look at game metrics, right? And you could look,
Hmm.
okay, how much
Yeah.
people are playing, are they, converting? Are they actually having fun with this, right? I think fun is a really hard thing to define,
Yeah,
right? Because
definitely.
everybody has a different definition of fun, right? So some people might like to just grind, for hours on end, and that's just their definition of fun. And somebody might just want to just progress through the story and just, have an interesting experience that, is thought provoking. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, to be honest, right? And you kind of I think if you're looking from a quantitative side, right, you can assign scores, you can perform surveys. That's really the best way. But I think like really is maybe also taking a step back and actually playing the game yourself, right, and just being saying, okay, well, what kind of people are actually interacting with this, right? What kind of experience are they having, and are we providing the best experience that they could be having for this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like that was kind of my so one of the last features I worked with was the card, I guess, pack feature. And it was like when I was playing through it specifically, right? I was saying to myself, it's like, well, where is the value for me, right? Like I'm opening this, right? But there's like a lot of confusion about how, for example, you get packs, right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, what if I just want to open packs, right? But I'm now limited to one per day, and there's no way to buy them, right? And I'm like, seems like such a ridiculous design oversight, right? Just
Yeah.
because if somebody wants to whale and they want a gacha, let them gacha. I don't think you're going to get backlash for that, right? It's just like you're giving them an option. Nobody's forcing you to.
Yeah, I think there is this thing in games a lot of times, and this is, I guess it's broader than just games. This goes to a lot of teams. Is that once people kind of get into their silos, once they specialize, whether it's in design or in production or publishing or whichever marketing, whichever side, you sort of have a lot of times this sort of weird ownership element of you almost don't want somebody else to come in and tell you what to do, right? You're kind of like, oh, like this is my purview. I've built my experience to this. And I think we do get to a point where a lot of people are like, this is kind of my bread and butter. I want to stop almost evolving this. Like, I don't mind being stagnant because, like, this is my tunnel vision of how the world works. And I've been doing it so long that this is what I see. And I've definitely seen this on the product side, especially with games, especially when looking at mobile games. It's like, a lot of them have come to the point where it feels desperate when it's just like, you just get the 50 pop-ups the first time you open the game again in like a month or two, right? It's like, we have this event, we have that event, we have this promotion, we have that promotion, give me this, give me that, give me that. And it's just like so much happening. And I'm just like, who thought this was a good idea to overwhelm the player with like just so much being thrown at them? Right? Before you can even dive back into the fun part of just playing a new level. It's like, I picked this up again, I just want to play a level, and now I'm just for the first next 5 minutes being bombarded with like ads or with like promotions or with like seasonal events or like this or that. I'm like, no, I just want to play the game. And we do, I think this is definitely a big problem in mobile, where it's come to a point where I think data and the way people have designed the systems come to really almost eke out like every little part from the player, right? Especially once you bucket them into like a different class. I think the bigger players, the whales or whatever, like they get the nicer experience because they're paying. And then as you lose value, you kind of just get almost churned into this cycle of oblivion with it. Um, I mean, what is your thought from a data perspective and from the perspective of a player having done both those things? Like, in terms of how these operations are handled in the game side.
So it's funny that you mention, it's like it almost feels predatory, right? But I've got a different
Oh,
actual take on this from the other side of it's actually usually the reason you get all those pop-ups is it has nothing to do with them trying to actively monetize you. It's actually just tech debt. So
yeah.
they're actually aware that this is an issue. They're aware this is a horrible experience, but they just kind of deprioritize it, right? Because you kind of look at what the player is, right? Which player should you focus on? And you can kind of say, okay, well, we care about the players that keep coming back, and they won't experience this problem, right? Because, well, they keep coming back, so they'll only see like a pop up once. So why would you dedicate engineering resources to kind of figuring out how to fix this pop up issue? Right now, I do think it's a problem when, for example, you're doing reactivation campaigns, right? So
Hmm.
then suddenly this is a real issue because you've just spent a lot of money trying to get this person back into your game, and they get back into your game and they can't even play, right?
Yeah.
They like, I mean, you're spamming them with things that they are not don't not even know how it works, right? Especially if they're a particular like past a certain progression milestone, right? Because I think at least the way that it worked in Love Implies is there was you kind of had a cooldown period until something appeared, but it was relatively early on, and then after that, all the pop-ups stopped appearing, and everything starts kind of accumulating in the process, right? And I think what's worse about Love and Play specifically, I hope I spoke to the devs, and I think they are fixing it, but it's they have this really fun thing of where they tell you the events you have missed and that have ended,
Mm.
right? And so if you missed a lot of them, you're just going through these constant loops, and some of them have cutscenes. I mean, you can
Oh
skip,
no.
but you have to load into the cutscene. They have to skip it, right? And it's just such a horrible experience, right? I think I remember like we were just talking about this, right? I try to log in and try to show you what's going on in the game, and I'm just sitting here for like 10 minutes, just scrolling, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, what can I do? Because naturally, like I wouldn't play it that much, right? From their perspective, I'd just be like, I go in when I have a feature and I just want to test that out and see. And also, usually, you wouldn't be using the actual, I guess, live game. You'd be using more, I guess, the internal testing version, so you could kind of do some more interesting things with the game. So
Skip
so
all
yeah,
the
I think
basics.
yeah, exactly. You can kind of just get past all that stuff, and that's why probably people ignore it as well because they think it's not that much of an issue because they have just the testing version, right? So you just get tunnel visioned and saying it's not an issue because I can just skip all this, right? But the fact that you need to skip all this is already an issue.
Yeah, yeah. And I think having that sort of bigger picture is definitely harder, especially when you're just kind of doing it as a job, right? Which I think a lot of people do
Yeah,
treat it as.
exactly. And it's also like it comes back to I guess also how quickly you iterate on features, right? So
Mm.
I think there's a lot of cases where it really depends on the pace that the whole organization moves at. But I think like that collection feature specifically, it took so long to develop. I think it took almost it was in development when I joined, or roughly it came into development a little before I joined, and I think it went live a little bit before I left, right? So that was almost a year in the cycle. So everybody that was working on it was just like, I just want this out. I just, I'm
Yeah.
not even questioning things anymore. I just want this out. And I get that, right? Because when you do spend so much of your time on one thing, and usually you probably got some other priorities going on, you just don't don't really have the capacity, and especially something that's just been sitting there and irking you constantly for the last year. You just want the pain to go away.
Yeah.
Now, does that generate a good experience for your players? No, not necessarily, but at least you got the feature out, right?
At least you got something to show for it at the end of the day, right? It doesn't
Yeah,
matter if it's good or
exactly.
bad.
You,
But
you need
yeah,
to show
no.
your manager, you need to show the board that you have been doing work, and that's just the way it goes sometimes.
I mean, fair enough. I think, yeah, at the end of the day, that's also a big thing of his, right? Like, this is still a job for a lot of people. It's like you need to show progress, and especially in this economy in games, not the best place to be. So it's like you don't want to get fired. So you need to, I guess, roll things out and hope it just works. And I think honestly, that's how a lot of games work, right? It's just you kind of just build something and you just like hope that, just fingers crossed, it clicks. But no, I mean, I guess on some of the flip side there, like the other side, I know you mentioned some of it where it's like you're saying it's not necessarily as predatory because it's just tech debt and all that. But one thing I'm always very interested with is sort of the economy design for a lot of these kind of games. Because there's definitely predatory practices in a lot of mobile games, a lot of free to play games. I guess how did you guys approach that? How was the monetization layer in Trailmix, like the design of the economy itself, the way that it all worked and implemented to either provide, I guess, a wholesome experience without hyper monetization, or to just monetize the crap out of your people? I mean, did you have different, I guess, customer bases where you're like, okay, this is a low value customer now. We're just gonna shoot them with everything and try and milk them for any pennies they can give. And then the flip side is just like high value now. We want to treat them better.
So I don't think this kind of segmentation actually happened at Trailmix, funnily enough. Generally, the way we classified a high value player would be somebody that just plays a lot, right?
Mm,
So it would be just somebody that goes in every day and just, does their dailies or something, right? And that would be a high value player, right? They would, if they don't generate any revenue, they generate ad revenue. Now, those people that do come in every day do tend to spend more, right? And it's not really about like shoveling things in their face and hoping for the best, right?
yeah.
It's like I think it's generally about the general ethos, the idea that I think like Trailmix tries to go for is more about providing value, so you don't feel that what you're getting is predatory. It's like you're paying
Yeah.
something, but it's helping you progress, right? It's like you're not, because I think like generally the game is relatively generous with just the amount of resources it gives you and what you can do. There is a few things. So there would be some cases where somebody would say, "Oh my god, I can't complete this order," and what's that feels predatory. But the funny thing is, that has nothing to do, with the monetization side. That's just literally just that the algorithm was a little bit crap, and it just doesn't account for this, and it just gives you
Yeah.
something that's impossible to complete, right? And that's not a great play experience, right? But that's not something that was consciously done. And I think that's actually something they had as a priority on what they were working on, and hopefully they release eventually. But those kind of things are really hard to fix, right? And I guess like after you technically do fix those, like there will probably be a side of that would be like, oh, how do we monetize people, right? But generally, I feel it would be more just like little nudges rather than, oh, you can't play the game at all, so just
Yeah.
but pay us like $100 or go away, right? So it's at least that wasn't the the vibe that was there when I was there. They might have changed since, but that's kind of my experience.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've heard mostly positive things about Trailmix in general. So I think, yeah, as a company, they're definitely not the worst, I guess, contender of this particular practice. But I know it's a pretty common sort of thing in mobile, and the industry's gotten a lot of sort of flack for it as well. Okay, no, that's fair enough. I think it's interesting to see that, I guess, how they're prioritizing it slightly differently and how that's informing on the build. And obviously, it's worked for them because it's quite a successful game, by and large. But I guess changing gears. So, say you're starting out, a new product, and you want to incorporate data somehow, because a lot of people listening here will be kind of indies or pretty early on in their stage of building a product. What are like the common sort of pitfalls and traps when you're looking at data that you would like to avoid, or what's the common, at least in an MVP stage, is a nice to have for future proofing your, I guess, data pipeline to minimize tech debt, even if that's going to exist? Like, how would you go about approaching building a pipeline for a game in particular?
This question brings up a lot of repressed memories. So let's I guess just a great way to unpack that first is if you do have a data team, you should involve them basically from day one in some way in the conversation, just even in the design steps, right? Just saying, hey, we're going to make this thing, right? How's it going to fit? Because essentially, your data team is intertwined with every single part of the business, right? It would be the probably talking to devs on some sort of pipeline issues or something in the data that's going on. That's any problems with tracking, and then you'll be talking to marketing about optimizing the ROI, and speaking to product about just the general health of the game. So data has a lot of valuable insights just to provide on that sense, right? If you have a data team, right? So involving them like the steps earlier is just always great because then you can get additional insights, right? I don't think anybody in data is going to tell you, oh, I don't think you're monetizing this correctly or anything like that, right? Or I don't think, I think this feature is stupid, right? It's like there'll be some sort of input, right? That might just help get the feature to be a bit better, right? And this is not really something that I saw a lot of Trailmix. I think where the frustration from our team was where we were just kind of looped in last minute. So then what happens is there's this feature that's basically about to go live, and people are waiting for you to essentially create the data model to track it, but you're doing this like very last minute, right? So the dev is stressed because they have like a thing they want to push, they have a release they need to push, and you're stressed because you don't even know what the feature is, right? You now have to talk to people to figure out how everything works so you can design it optimally, right? And that process just falls apart in the if you have something like this happening. So ideally, you start from the ideation phase, right? With the designers, you start speaking about just okay, so what do you see this being, right? And then the data team can one provide insights, but two also on their side start like prepping for things. But okay, we're probably going to need to do this, right? We probably need to allocate some resources to rebuilding these things because there might be some sort of bottleneck that just wasn't seen, right? Because you have all these legacy issues. So you're like, okay, probably going to need to change this to make this work. And then from that stage, right, it's like, because obviously the feature is going to change and it's going to evolve, right? It's more about just keeping them in the loop until something needs to be built up properly for it. But at least when it comes to that, it's probably already going to be sort of there compared to non-existent. And like, the deadline is tomorrow, go for it.
Good luck.
And good luck. Yeah, that was my experience. And yeah, and then that at least would just generate a much better release, right? Because then because what usually would happen with these releases is you would want to monitor like the rollout. So it'd be usually an A/B test that goes live, and then you would be saying, okay, we've added 1,000 players, how are they performing, right? And you would already have the actual model built to do that, right? You'd have the dashboards, everybody could see, and you could discuss the health of the feature as you do the rollout. Otherwise, you do have this bottleneck, right? Then essentially you just have something out there that you have no visibility on, right? Mm-hmm. And what's the point of releasing something you have no idea what it's doing, right? It could be breaking your game, and you've just been like, oh yeah, I guess it's fine.
Right? Yeah.
So that's I guess the best way to incorporate data team in this scenario would be if you don't have a data team, right? Then it's more about, I guess, maybe bring somebody in who can just consult you on the best practices forward, because I feel the development is usually very different because I think devs are not usually proficient in SQL, right? And usually SQL is used a lot in the data pipeline modeling layer. And you have to do very specific things to make certain things work. So, for example, the things we got a lot at Trailmix was they like to nest arrays within arrays, and maybe like some other dictionaries. Basically, more data structures like that kind of just cascade. And you don't want that because SQL just hates that. It's performantly just a nightmare. Like it's an anti-SQL statement, which means it will just not run well. If it runs at all. And if it does run, it's going to cost you a lot of resources and money, right? So it's about really setting up your data stack just to kind of handle this sort of thing. At least not even a data stack, more just, I guess, setting up your tracking, to account for these little pitfalls. And it does depend really on also just what your setup is, right? We had BigQuery specifically, so there's consideration you need to make there. That might not necessarily be something that comes from a different database like Snowflake, which is a little bit better at this. I think you could like plug in some Python into it and make it do things that maybe BigQuery just doesn't want to do in the same way. Again, I feel following standard best practice probably is the best way forward, but it's something to consider. So yeah, I feel the problem is usually data falls a bit on the back burner when somebody's developing, right? Especially, it's more of like, oh, we're going to release. We probably want some tracking on that, right? But nobody thought about how that tracking would look like when they first were like developing. So then it's all kind of added as almost an afterthought. And if it's an afterthought, that's the sort of insights you're going to get. You're going to get like sort of insights that are half baked, right? You're not going to be able to get the visibility you want, right? And I think that goes for any business, to be honest, right? So it's like if I'm selling just like products, right? And I want to know what the profit loss is. But if I'm not tracking what I'm selling things for, right? Suddenly
it's going to be hard to do.
Yeah, it's like you're doing a lot of workarounds to figure out something that should have been really easy if you just did the work beforehand. And it's not a really sexy work to do, right? But it's just, it has to be done.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, right? Like especially doing startups, working in a lot of different roles, it's really like the admin work, right? It's like those really boring basic menial tasks, like plugging in basic numbers or looking at the basic metrics or doing a lot of the simpler stuff or writing down documentation, a big pain point in the tech world. It's like all those little just things that will just be more menial. Like they'll not necessarily be hard to do. They might just consume some time, but they'll be kind of boring, right? I think that's the thing that a lot of people struggle with, especially in society today. And that is sort of one of the most core, like important functions to actually get done because it like future proofs the most in a way. It like puts you in a better place overall, but it's just hard to do find the motivation to it because like I said, it's not sexy work, right? It's not the exciting big shiny thing. It can lead to that and it's a great foundation for that, but it isn't that. And I think that's something I've definitely seen a lot of teams sort of struggle with. I mean, I've also definitely struggled with it myself, where it's like, okay, doing a day of like data entry or a day of updating documentation is definitely not going to be the most fun day I've spent that week, right? But it is going to be the thing that might help the next few weeks be a lot easier to work with. So yeah, I think that's one of the big things just generally from a lot of people that I've spoken and from my own experiences in startup that like that is the work that is the most crucial in a way. It's not the big releases, it's not like the big fancy shit. It's doing all that like basic menial labor tasks that leads to all of those running smoothly more than anything else. So I think that's just a good lesson for like any founder or just anybody out there who's building a game or any other product to just have on board. I guess flipping out of now the data side and talking more about sort of the other experiences you've had at Trailmix in terms of exiting the games industry and a lot of that coming from the scale up issue. I've also worked in a lot of scale ups where we come to this level where you try and bring in people from other companies. You start to maybe get funding or you're at a certain point where you want to scale and build your team. And I think this is very common in a lot of games companies. And I think this is something that we've seen be a major issue, especially over the last few years, which has led to a lot of this kind of layoffs, is that a lot of people have ended up either hiring the wrong person or hiring for a skill set they don't quite understand. And this kind of goes back to in the beginning when we were talking about the different features for a data person and what it means. Because like, I've seen roles where it's been from different games companies where it's like data scientist, data consultant, data engineer, data analytics, whatever. And they essentially all want the exact same person or a subset of one of those categories, but don't actually understand it. They've just put the title out there because it sounds fancy and that's like what they Googled and it made sense based on an AI description or whatever. I don't know. So yeah, going on to I guess that hiring layer, what was like your experience in terms of working in the scale up side as a business was looking to grow in terms of how they brought on different people? How did that engage in terms of the culture and how did that change things in the team? I think that's always just a fascinating topic to discuss for me because like startups and scale up stuff, that's I think been one of the just biggest learnings that I've had compared to like going between startup, scale up, corporate and sort of the different ways that teams operate there. Because startups very hands-on, everyone's kind of doing everything, and you've got a very particular type of person who does that. And then you get scale-ups where you kind of start to blend that with a mix of, it's usually a lot like people who want a bit more job security, still, either early or mid-career, and they're like, okay, we want to do something cool. Or they're coming from a more traditional background and like don't necessarily know what they're getting into. So there's a lot of just weird things I think in the way that these different things work. So how was your experience in Trailmix? Like what did you see? How did that work in terms of the broader scope of the teams, how they were working, where it was going based on, I guess, some of these hiring decisions in terms of how the people were growing within the team as well?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned, just very vague job descriptions and just expecting to hire somebody that just does everything, right? Essentially, like at the start, I feel when somebody's like trying to hire a data team, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, we just want a data analyst, right?" But actually, you just want the whole data team, but you want to pay
Yeah.
one person, right? And that results, that's where your tech debt is really started coming from. It's like because like, well, yeah, when you want somebody that analyzes the data, and I guess like that makes sense in hindsight, right? But then you have to ask yourself a question of, well, do you have data to analyze? Like, or you have to get that from somewhere, right? And it's not really a data analyst that, specializes in getting that out. And I think that's the problem of just general, like data is relatively a new function, right? It's not that new, but it's still relatively new and it's not that well understood. that, I think the hiring managers need to be educated really on, what you need to expect from a data function, right? And I feel this the problem with just the misinformation that kind of goes about, people just doing a quick Google search, like, oh, this person's probably doing this, right? Or maybe this company's hired a data analyst and they're running the whole data pipeline, right? And that's probably the right way to do it. And it's like, that's not really usually the way you want to do it. But yeah, just like, I guess going back to like hiring decisions, it really it's interesting to see when the company is moving from, I guess, the startup to scale up phase, right? Especially like, I think I joined Trailmix at about, I don't remember, like 40, 50 people. I think when I joined, they just opened a new part of the office essentially. Before it was just a small office, and then they were just refurbishing one thing, and by the time I joined, it was there, right? And that kind of accommodated basically 50 people, I think,
Yeah.
at the end of the time. And then after that, we added also another studio, and I think the company almost grew to like 80-ish, maybe 100. I'm not entirely sure what the numbers were. But as you can imagine, right, even though that technically is not like ridiculously huge growth, especially because one of them is opening a studio completely, like a satellite studio outside, right? So that's about like 10-ish people that are not really even there, but they're in a separate country doing something else. That's still like a lot of management that you need to go, have to get through all these people. Because I think like when you're like working with a small team, or even like maybe like a team of like 20-ish people, it still becomes, it's relatively manageable for everybody to kind of do their own thing and everybody to be accountable. And you don't. And I think what happens is it's easy for everybody to communicate,
Yeah.
right? But once you start scaling, you need people that can facilitate this communication, right? Be like, okay, no, so these people need to talk to this. This is what my team needs to know. This is what this team needs to know, right? And that's why you generally hire like managers, right? That would be able to facilitate these kind of conversations, just so you have the people that are implementing, right? And you only have so many of those, so you need to free up as much of their time as possible so they can just get the work that needs to be done. Right? And the whole management thing, that's what they should be taking care of, right? Just facilitating this cross communication and making sure that the pipeline is always moving and there's nothing blocking it. And I feel like with Trailmix, I didn't really see this from the data side. We hired, I think, an ex Meta, ex Google, manager. So on paper, you would assume this person would be great, right? And in the same sense, right, I didn't see a problem with that hiring decision because I joined roughly the same time she did, right? But as you work through, then you realize maybe these people that come from these larger corporate backgrounds and they only know the corporate backgrounds, right? They don't have the scrappy nature of people that have worked at startups and like just these smaller businesses where essentially every second counts almost, right? And they just kind of just waffle one way, waffle another way from meeting to meeting, right? Like you have a conversation with the person and they just kind of say, and I'm in meetings, right? And it's like, but where are these meetings going? Like,
Yeah.
is there something we should know, right? And that's kind of the problem, really. Of like, they kind of expect this hierarchy and kind of expect that, okay, well, we're not really need to do much, at least from my perspective in the corporate, like you're not really doing as much as you're doing at a scale up, just because there's a lot less reliant on you, right? You don't, if you don't do something, it's probably going to be fine. Like the world's not going to burn down tomorrow. Like the company's still going to function just fine, right?
Yeah.
Because there's probably another 20 other people that are doing the same job as you. With a scale up, you can't have that mentality. You just have to say, no, I'm going to get this done. If it's not getting done, I'm picking it up, even if it's not even realistically my responsibility. And I think that's what everybody that was there beforehand did, right? But then as we brought more people in, there was a lot of frustration with these people coming from the larger companies, right? That just saying, we're just gonna kind of talk but not really get anything done, or we're kind of gonna add processes to like slow the pipeline down, which is, I think that generates a lot of friction, right? Because, and that's actually quite a lot of people, just including myself, right, like left because of this kind of friction, because we're saying like, well, we came here to do things, we want to be able to generate valuable output, right? And we just can't with this kind of environment. um, I think just from speaking to some people in the company since I left, like that is changing. That is something that obviously like the leadership is addressing, and I think like that's just like just a big like I think that it should be just kept in mind. Like the leadership actually does care about this, which is great, right? Because I feel like I think if they get to a certain point, sometimes leadership might not care. They'll be like, ah,
Yeah.
it's working, it's generating money. Who cares about the little guy, right? But generally, I think that's the main advantage of Trailmix is just more the caring nature of everybody that was working there prior, right? So everybody that is high up does actually care, and they were there when the company was a lot smaller, so they still have some empathy, I guess.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I've been part of a lot of startups and scale ups, and I've seen a very similar sort of transition across multiple ones. And I think there's also a separation. I mean, I think when you first start with a startup, the people that you get are all invested, right? These are all people that, like you said, want to do things. They know they have to wear a lot of hats. They know they have to put in the hard work, but that's part of the fun. It's part of the challenge of growing something from scratch and being able to learn at like a relatively fast-paced rate in an environment. And I think when you get to scale up and then go on the path to a corporate, there's different ways in how it's handled. I think if you're like VC funded, the end goal is an exit. So sometimes there is external pressure to build quicker, which can definitely lead to worse hiring decisions because you don't necessarily have as much time. And then you rely on sort of more outside factors like ex Google, ex Meta, all that stuff. I mean that's just on a side note. One thing that always kind of confuses me when I'm looking at a scale up company when they specifically go to hire people from those kind of environments is like, what is your logic behind that as a hiring manager, right? Because if they're coming from a massive corporate, and sure, you could have a cultural fit where they're like, I do a lot of stuff, I work much faster, blah blah blah, but you don't necessarily know that from the person. And if that person is good, a place like Google or Meta can just pay them like almost near infinite wealth to make them stay if they're a valuable resource. So for me, it's very hard to find someone from a traditional corporate background like that at a management level that is good, who will be willing to make that transition and jump into sort of a startup-y scale-up environment where they might have a bit more responsibility. I think that's the main reason, right? You come in because you think you'll get more responsibility and can grow your career faster from an environment like that, where you obviously grow and scale much in a much smaller way. But if you're good, I don't understand why those companies would ever let you go. So it is kind of this weird dichotomy of like, a lot of times I think these signals almost given too much weight in terms of the preferences that people get over specifically just getting the right talent in. And one of the things that I've definitely noticed, and I think this changes as you also grow from a startup to scale up and become more experienced, is like being able to admit when you're wrong, right? Like when it comes to even hiring a wrong person, you can cut that. Like you'll find out within like the first month or two if you have like a kind of warm, closed family community, which you usually do in the earliest startup stage, where if a new person comes in and they don't culturally fit or they have a very different way of working that just doesn't mesh with the company, I think you find out very quickly that this person is not the right fit. And I think the best thing to do is then to just cut them. Like that's one of the hardest decisions to make, because it's also failing on your side, right? As HR, as leadership, to have brought this person in the first place. And it definitely sort of hits morale. But I think the long-term damage that kind of thing can do is just so much worse, that it's better to bite that bullet and just take the loss, admit that you were wrong, and hopefully learn from that and hire somebody better, even if they don't have that shiny background, or even better, like enable somebody in your own team to grow into a more managerial role. I think I've seen a lot of startups where they just don't scale the people internally and look for the outside person to come in and do that. And I think, we can debate the back and forth of the benefits of this forever. Essentially, I think both sides have their merits or not. And there are people that I've seen who've transferred from a more corporate environment and have done really, really well. Like they wanted to be in that kind of startup vibe. They have sort of the more traditional, rigid functionality of how teams work in corporates, in a more political environment, in a place with siloed teams where communication is a big thing. And I think the main thing is that I've seen in the successful ones is that they are the people that are more accountable. They take those actions into their own consideration, and they are accountable for their mistakes. They're accountable for their teams, and they're not just there to use it as a leg up, which unfortunately is what I've seen in a lot of scale ups. Is a lot of people come from a traditional big corporate, and then they're kind of just trying to use it as a leg up to get to the next big thing, or have a thing of like I was like an analyst or a senior, and now I'm like the head of a department. And so when I go back to that corporate or whichever side, I'll be a team lead who's almost, I don't know, 1.5 or doubled my salary. And I think a lot of times you've just got to be aware that there is a career ladder game that some of these people play. And you just have to sort of be able to navigate that and be careful, especially who you're hiring at a manager level and how they're going to mesh with the cultural ethos. And yeah, get rid of it if it's not a good fit early on. I think that's probably the best thing I can advise from my own experiences. But yeah, it really does shape your experience. And like you said, like, I mean, that was ultimately like the main thing that also led you to, and other people, to kind of leave this kind of environment, right? And it's the same in other companies I've been in, where really good talent that could have been scaled up, that could have done a lot, was just let go because of some of that management layer, and because people in leadership did not want to admit they were wrong, or didn't even necessarily know what was happening to a certain degree within those teams. So I think it is just something that's very important if you are going through that transitionary phase, to just keep an eye on, because more than your business failing, it's literally the people, and especially those early people that really helped build the thing and know it best. And especially if they haven't left any documentation, you don't want them to leave. So it is just worth recognizing, I think, all of that, and seeing if there is a way to mitigate some of those. That's the biggest scale up problem that I've generally seen in companies, but it is something I think can be nipped in the bud with a little bit more just management experience in consideration, which is tougher in general from what I've seen in the games industry, because at least from the generational way that it's worked, we've had this thing of almost like games industry veterans are almost the outcasts of their time. And even up until maybe like a couple of years ago, I think games really became mainstream around COVID. And that's completely shifted the way the industry and the world views the industry, but also the way the industry interacts with the rest of the world. But I definitely do see this thing of like, because we're where we are now, a lot of people want to come into games more seriously and consider it like almost a traditional career, right? Like this is a thing that you're not now an outcast. You're not doing something weird. You are making a serious product. You have the capacity to earn a living on it, and people aren't necessarily calling you sort of like the nerd or the outcast or any of that. Whereas, when we were younger, growing up, playing games, doing all that stuff, you were kind of like that nerd in the corner or that outcast in the wider sort of ethos of society. And I think that was just more extreme when you're looking at sort of the leadership level layer that sort of conceptualized and got the games industry to the point that we're in now. And I think a lot of those leaders generally just need to understand that this industry is just shifting in terms of how it's perceived from the outside world, in terms of how you partner with them. And management layer is going to be just a very big, crucial component, like it is in basically every other sort of more mature industry, to get a company to a point of scale beyond just the indie level. So I think that's just a big sort of pain point period that we're kind of seeing in the games industry in general, and more broadly in tech as well. But yeah, games especially, I think, because there's never been sort of this focus on the soft skills side, on the management skills side, especially when you're looking at more traditional PC console style games. I think mobile being a little bit newer, being a bit more sort of like, having a bit more of the tech SaaS product elements does tend to do that a little bit better because it's a bit more familiar. But yeah, traditional games, still a lot in the companies there that needs to be kind of sorted out from a management level, and in terms of being able to, get it to some semblance of a normal sort of traditional company where management actually knows a lot about how to do the management layer, and haven't just kind of been pushed into that role when they're not ready for it, don't want it. So yeah, I guess that's more just general tangential thing from my side that's always just one of an interest to me, but I think is just very crucial that a lot of people in this industry kind of need to hear and need to understand better. But yeah, that I think, everything you said, both from the data side, from the management layer, it's been really just, a good sort of introduction, I think, for a lot of people in terms of how to think about these things and getting a little bit of the other side of the story, because that's definitely something I faced when I was in more of the data function or the product function in traditional gaming, was there was pushback from other teams of like, why are we doing this? And I think that still exists. I think that still exists, maybe like less so in mobile, definitely, but in traditional games, it does exist, though it is kind of going down. And I think data, marketing, product, these kind of things are becoming more sort of normalized terms and normalized functions in games. There is still a lot of sort of pushback and misunderstanding on what these functions do. So like hearing about your experiencing, hearing about, like how it works between tech and games, what the transitions there has been really useful. And I think just for everyone listening, like it's a good sort of introduction to the data function and how you can try and use it. And then also on the management side, like hearing about sort of the problems and how that directly left to you leaving the games industry in a way as well. So it's things like that I think are just crucial stories for people to sort of understand and learn from. So thank you so much for sharing. It's been sort of really informative hour, and it's always fun to chat with you on things about data and all this stuff. I know I always learn a lot, and just seeing you always sort of strive for doing more in this space, and being kind of on the edge of just challenging yourself to build more is always just a really inspiring thing to see. So thank you so much for being on here and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you for having me. It's just been a great conversation. Also to learn a lot, just having these conversations, trying to explain maybe somebody's a little bit more outside the data scope, because the industry is very small. Like everybody, within our scope kind of knows each other, and we kind of just talk our own jargon. So it's always great to just, talk a bit more openly and a bit more in a, a bit more accessible way.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to shout out? Any last tips or any bits about yourself or anything where people want to follow you or get in touch or anything else?
Not specifically. I think just maybe just a tip on just if anybody wants to get into the data industry, or just ways to do so.
Yeah.
And I feel there's a lot of places that will sell you, courses on how to do A, B, and C. And I feel the main thing you need to really think about just more about building something yourself, and just trying to maybe like even build out a really small product and then try to, just build some analytics around that. That's probably the best way for you to learn and the best way to provide something of value. If you also are looking into getting into data specifically, I wouldn't say games data is the best entry point, just because usually you need multiple years of experience. I think even our junior data analyst had 2 years of experience prior somewhere else. So look for maybe smaller companies, maybe like similar things of a data consultancies that are willing to take people on and train them. Just make sure that people that do know their stuff, so you just learn the best ways to do things, so you have a great career trajectory going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim.